Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm so glad for everybody who's joining us today. Today's conversation is part of the A-CBT blog and author spotlight series, where we feature leaders in cognitive and behavioral therapies and highlight work that brings together clinical practice, research, and innovation from all over the world. And as a reminder, we invite all diplomates and fellows who are interested in contributing to reach out with their ideas and participate in future episodes of this spotlight. I'm so honored today to be joined by Professor Emily Holmes. Emily is a clinical psychologist and neuroscientist whose research focuses on mental imagery and its role in emotional disorders and psychological treatment. She's a professor in the Department of Women's and Children's Health at Uppsala University. Her work has been especially influential in advancing imagery-based approaches to PTSD, bipolar disorder, and depression, and she's the recipient of multiple international awards recognizing her scientific contributions. Emily, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Katie, it's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me.
So let's talk about your research. So when did you first start noticing that mental imagery, rather than just words, was playing such a big role in people's distress?
That's such an interesting question because I think I was slightly becoming aware of it even before I started my clinical psychology training.
Oh,
Uh, and one of the very first jobs that I had the privilege of doing in mental health was actually in New York, in Harlem, and I was helping the Columbia Community Outreach Center by running an art therapy and supporting art therapy groups. And in that group, I was noticing how people who were very quiet otherwise were finding it easier to express things in images. So I guess if I look back, to be honest, that's probably the first time. But it was only in my clinical training that I realized this visual thing, these are mental images.
yeah. Absolutely. It's such an important observation. The field is grateful for you identifying that. And it's so funny because I think that, despite the fact that you and I are so far apart in terms of geography, I was already sort of being influenced by the earliest work that you had, or that you were doing. So one thing that really stands out in your work is how often imagery shows up where we might otherwise expect thoughts in words. And so what struck you about how often people weren't struggling with thoughts as sentences, but with these brief but very vivid experiences in their mind's eye?
Well, I think it took a while, Katie, because at first, like once I started clinically training and was inspired so much by colleagues from your side of the pond, actually in that, I remember really it was the real giants like Christine Padetsky who brought these terms to life for me, actually named it as mental imagery, and I felt it became more legitimate to study in a way. Um, and I work with people after trauma with PTSD. That was very clear that those intrusive memories were images. But then I had the privilege to work with a whole range of students and colleagues where we'd say, I wonder if we ask similar questions to other client groups. Like, what if we asked the similar questions like, what do you see in your mind's eye, but say to our clients with agoraphobia instead? That was one of the very first studies, I think, back 2004. Or what if we do that in bipolar? And then to my great surprise. I mean, it was really like a voyage. We go into these different areas, have the privilege of talking to clients, and realize that if we explained imagery carefully enough, they would then share their images with us. And then it became not that imagery is the exception, but rather, at least in anxiety disorders, that imagery is the rule, that something in there was coming along in an imagery-based form, not just in words.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that you mentioned anxiety disorders, agoraphobia. I think, but for my early influence from Christine as well, I don't think that I would attend so closely to those mental images that really drive so much of the emotional experience that people have. So I remember when I was reading your article there was this moment that you had, this clinical moment when imagery kind of clicked for you as something that was really therapeutically powerful. I was wondering if you'd tell that story.
Well, I remember working with an elderly lady who had agoraphobia and really suddenly realizing that it wasn't so much that she was afraid of leaving the house, it was that she was petrified of what would happen to her if she fell over. And she could see all these people crowding around with great big starry eyes. And when she revealed to me what it was she saw, I was like, but that's I wouldn't want to leave either. I mean, her behavior made complete sense. So that's when it really clicked because she had some mobility problems and a pure exposure, sort of graded exposure, physical exposure, even though that was in the manual at the time that I was meant to be following. We just thought, what if we explore this thing that you've just told me instead? And then it really clicked. I think I had such an enormous humbling experience working with her, realizing how powerful the imagery was, but also how she had the creativity once we could talk about this picture to change this picture. And
Mm.
then when you work with someone in changing that image, the sheer relief that you can suddenly see flow over into somebody. I mean, now
Yeah.
we call that imagery rescripting. It's quite incredible. And
Yeah.
that was pivotal for this lady who hadn't been outside for years, enabling to open the front door and go out for real again. And that transformed my attitude to perhaps empowering clients to help us understand, but in particular, really wanting to explore and help people explore their imagery and where that would lead us.
Yeah, so true. And it's interesting, right? That client, that case that you just described, right? That sort of an image is exactly the type that would be so powerful for someone, but if they're so
Yeah,
anxious about it, they're like, oh, so frightened by it that they're like just immediately wanting to push it away from their mind. And so we're not going to get there unless we really ask
I
about
couldn't
those.
agree more, Katie,
Yeah,
because I think part of it is pushing it away. And for most of us, unless we've got a training in art, it's not like usual, is it, to talk about imagery over breakfast or whatever.
it's true.
It's like you have to be a little humble. Like this is not a conversation people have had. And sometimes people either it's so real to them they don't realize it's an image, or it's so brief. I mean, that's the other thing that I just can't believe how kind of interesting it is that an image can be 200 milliseconds. That's all an image usually is.
Yeah.
That's a tiny fraction of a second, and yet it can have this incredibly powerful impact. So it's easy for people to miss the power of a brief image because it is so fleeting.
That's right. Right. And often, right, people just aren't even aware that they're having them, despite the
Mm.
fact that they're so powerful. But that was also very striking to me as I read through your article about the brevity of these
Yeah,
experiences. And but when we hear an example like that, we can hear why it is that that would be such a powerful moment for this person, despite how
ex
brief it is and how it would drive people's
exactly,
behavior. So
exactly.
I wanted to get to another term that I think is so important. So, I think a lot of clinicians who work with trauma have heard about flashbacks, but
Mhm.
now we have this term, right, that you're using called flash forwards. And I have to say, it's like as I started thinking about this flash forward, it comes up a lot for anxiety
Mm.
disorders and
Yeah.
PTSD. So, how did you come to realize that these future-oriented images could be just as powerful as memories of the past?
Well, I've been working in a traumatic stress clinic for a while, and of course, and I got used to working with intrusive memories flashbacks. I felt very comfortable clinically working with that. And I was lucky enough to get my first research grant to work in the Department of Psychiatry in Oxford. And there I met some amazing colleagues like the wonderfully Melanie Fennell, among others.
Mm,
And Melanie with Mark Williams was running a trial on people with chronic suicidality. And I suppose being the imagery obsessed, I think I must have said something like, have people talked about imagery? And they said, no, never. Um, and and then was speaking to somebody on one of the inpatient wards and realized that this person was there for this their suicidality, but the staff were saying they went to a very, very specific, they tried to escape to go to a very specific place with a
Mm,
beach and and I just knew that if were going to escape in that very specific way, you'd probably have a visual goal in mind. You'd know where you want to go. And so I
right.
said, and I had the great privilege that Melanie and Mark and others let me work with their patients after they'd finished the mindfulness trial and just ask them the same questions, but about instead, what was your trauma memory? I would ask them, when your suicidality was at its worst, were there any images that came to mind?
Hmm.
And that was the first time, based on that, again, this client who'd opened up to me about that they did have an image about going to this beach, um, that I was able to realize the first person I asked that, they started to say, "Oh, yeah, is that an image?" And then describe a very specific scenario, so sadly related to self-harm and suicide. And
Yeah,
then the next person, the same. And
yeah,
there were to me this intensity that you get with a flashback, but projecting forward to an act in the future or the
right,
consequences in the future. And
right.
therefore, it became very important to think about imagery as like mental time travel. It either throws you back to the past or it propels you forward to the future. And if it's something dangerous,
Yes,
like harming yourself, or as you say, an anxiety, an impending danger or impending threat, then these flash forwards can have an enormous impact, both on the
right.
person's emotions, but also on their behavior, as we see in anxiety nowadays.
Absolutely. It's interesting. As you were saying that, I was thinking, I think that was probably the first experience I had hearing about your work that you were doing was
Oh,
that mental imagery in suicide. And I remember we were discussing it in our consultation group with Christine, and we were talking about that sometimes it's like the fantasy, right?
yeah,
The fantasy of suicide. And so, as I started attending to that, I realized that, some of my clients had this image of sort of being discovered, right? And
yeah,
people weeping and feeling terrible regret, etc. But the image that they had was maybe really not realistic, right?
yes,
I remember a particular client sort of had this image, I think, of kind of herself as a sleeping beauty, but as we know, right, that would not be reality if somebody had overdosed or et cetera, right? That would not be reality. And so working within the
yeah.
image, right?
But in the image, she's seeing it like that. And that
Right,
links very closely, actually, Katie, to what we found in our research, which is the more positive people found their suicidal fantasies, the
that's right.
higher their suicide risk, because it became
Yeah,
a vision of an escape, for example,
right,
that it was peaceful, beautiful, that they got their revenge, whatever it might be.
right,
And so I guess as CBT therapist, one of the really important things there is to an image isn't necessarily maladaptive because it's negative. An image can also be maladaptive because it's seductive and positive and it's making
right,
someone behave in a dangerous way. Just as you're sort of saying with your lady with the fantasy of how she looked perfect.
right.
Whereas what we'd want to do in CBT is really evaluate that and think,
That's right.
is that the outcome and is that what you want? And try and protect the person that way.
Right, absolutely. And that, you sort of touched on this, but I want to make sure that we cover it sort of, a little more comprehensively. So, what do you think? Where should people start when they, as us CBT therapists, where should we start when we want to start directly working with images?
Ooh, such a nice question. So, you know, I th I think that the start, the most important thing is actually finding a language and giving a definition of imagery. Because I think we just cannot underestimate how foreign and uncomfortable it is for most people to talk about images. So a good place to start is just to say, we can think in two ways. We can either think in words and language, the way you and I are talking now, or
Hmm.
we can think in mental pictures and images, or even short videos clips. That latter is called mental imagery, and kind of give people permission. And when we provide a definition of what we're talking about, you can often see an aha moment go off. And then I would normally go for a kind of example that maybe is a little neutral and safe, like and sort of say, if we shut our eyes together, could you imagine an apple or, wherever we might be. And once we've got what just started with a clear set of definitions, that's a really good place. Because then you can start an assessment. Because if you go straight in to say, do you have any images? I think many, many people won't really be clear what, even that's a familiar term to psychologists and psychiatrists and others, it's not a familiar term to most of us in the general population.
Right.
And then once we've got that, then we can start our CBT assessment as normal. But I would say that we should add an extra few things to the assessment, which I'm happy to mention briefly if we've got time.
Yes, we have time. Go.
Okay. So one of the things that I mean, uh, one of the things I love to do with the assessment is to draw out to make the assessment more visual. So have a little picture of the image in the middle. That's the center. What's the image of? But just in a very brief way, like the image. Okay, let's take the lady at the beginning of me falling over and eyes staring at me. Okay, that's the image. And then I think what could be very helpful is to, because the image is so incredibly brief, and because images is a bit different from verbal thoughts, to just sort of unpack it a bit. So to sort of do what we would call microformulate the image.
That's right. Yeah.
And when we microformulate it, it makes me feel like the nerdy scientist, but it's like putting it under the microscope. So it's like, let's tease out there, okay? So what are the key emotions that come up? Often more than one. So let's say the fallen over image in the eyes, it might be fear, but it also might be shame.
Shame, right? Or embarrassment, right? Yeah.
Embarrassment, yeah. And then check, and we all know these are our normal CBT skills. And then what appraisals? And just making that person like themselves bring, a picture says 1,000 words, right?
Right.
So we're helping them put words to that picture, which validates how much impact it's having. So what the appraisals are. And often that's a real click moment.
Right.
But then the next thing that's most unusual about images, and let me foray into neuroscience just briefly, is that when we use words, that words are just words. They're not real. They're a communication tool. Yeah? So we can do things with words. We can say, I like pizza, I don't like pizza. I like small pizzas, I like large. But you can just play with words. You can change words. And we're all very comfortable doing that. Now, images don't act like that. Images are in a different part of your brain. Images are visual cortex, occipital lobes, straight big pathways into emotion centers. They're more like the truth as far as our brain's concerned.
Yeah.
So a mental image is an as-if simulation of reality. Your brain is not going to, in the moment, know the difference. So you can't play with it in the same way. Right. You can play with it, but not in the same way we can change linguistic meaning. Now, this neuroscience thing about images, and that's just kind of amazing to me that we've only, been scanning images and really seeing that they're real, like really in just in like the 80s and like, only a couple of decades ago.
Right.
Because they really take up the same areas as real perception, like really sealing the thing, they feel real.
Yeah.
And you and I know for everybody with anxiety, if something feels real, it's given more weight.
That's right.
It's given more value.
Absolutely.
So we always have a box when I'm unpacking the image.
Even if logic, right? Even if that logical part of our brain is saying, oh, no, it's not going to happen. It doesn't matter. Powerful.
It doesn't penetrate the visual part. The visual part and the verbal part are different. So even if you're logically saying, I don't, I don't like pizza. If your image is delicious, gooey pizza, you're going to be like,
Yeah,
so seeing is believing. So we have to so when I break down the image, after you've done the sort of appraisals and emotions, which I think most of us as CB therapists are comfortable with, we then spend a big moment pausing on saying, what's the special power of this image? Because it's an image.
Right.
And then it's exactly like you're saying, it's not logical. It could be real. Like it's slightly different for everyone, but it has this extra hold. Like what does that person do? What's the power? Which means that you're reacting to this image in a way you wouldn't if it was just a verbal thought. And that's A, the most incredibly interesting thing, but B, super empowering because people start to realize, well, I'm not going mad.
Right. There's
If
a
I saw a
reason.
saber, there's a
Yeah,
reason. And if I saw a tiger for a millisecond, 200
that's
milliseconds, I'd
right.
run as well. Like I experience this as if it's real, but it has this extra power over me, this hold.
It's true. Yeah, it's funny, it's hard for me to imagine how people could work with certain disorders without attending to imagery, right? Having done this now for a while, it's hard to imagine. But I have to get to this. Talk to me about Tetris. How does Tetris,
Oh,
how does playing
oh.
Tetris get into your work? How did that come about? Talk to me about that.
Okay, Katie. So this is really exciting. So I'm really passionate about working with imagery and assessing it and microformulating it. And there are lots of really good CBT techniques to work with imagery scripting, imaginal exposure, metacognitive techniques, you name it. Really brilliant. We should all use every imagery toolkit, but there's no
I agree.
just one way of dealing with imagery. And in my clinical work, I was becoming really interested in ideas of um, when we want to treat a lot of people or people who might want to talk, or what was the least we could do to change an intrusive image after trauma.
Hmm.
And I was also really interested in, well, I've been a bit alluding to the neuroscience and where things happen in the brain, thinking, I wonder if in CBT we can go, when we have a formulation, we could go in at emotions, we could
Right?
go in at appraisals,
Hmm.
but what if we went in at the perceptual format?
Hmm.
Like, would there be a way that we actually could, as it were, rub out a little bit how vividly perceptual that image was? And
Hmm.
just by eroding the carrier of the message, as in the image itself,
Right.
it would it would help the content recede. Does that make sense?
It does make
And the
sense.
reason Tetris comes in is that the research or clinical research question I had was how do we reduce the number of times an intrusive image of trauma pops to mind, flashes back?
Hmm. Hmm.
And over many, many experiments, which I won't go into detail, but we can another time, we began to realize that you could use these tasks that competed with imagery, and that comes from the kind of working memory literature.
Hmm.
So, not verbal tasks, but imagery competing tasks like, well, all of us who've done waste block design, that's an imagery task, yeah?
Right.
But, and then I spent a number of years in the lab doing all of that and working out how long you'd have to do it and how long the queue had to be to the memory recall and all that kind of stuff. But then there's a lot of debate at the time saying we can't, what if we were to take this to the real world? How could we find a task within our, as it were, behavioral procedure
Hmm.
going that bringing the image to mind and then doing something to erode it? Could we use something a bit more fun? What do people have that's more available? Like, imagine that therapy being fun. Actually, that's another
Right.
Christine moment. Like, therapy can be fun.
It
So,
can be fun. That's true.
and it was young students really. We were having debates. I mean, about which computer games at the time and who had what on their mobile phone. And some of these computer games really do have features that include space and color and motion.
Yeah.
Lovely, lovely, delicious visual spatial tasks. And Tetris is one of those. So
Right.
that's what we started to trial, like in my what we call the imagery competing task intervention procedure, ICTI.
Hmm.
It's actually got several components, taking out the visual spatial task component and using a fun game. And
Right.
and
To
this was
manipulate,
really
right? Yeah.
interesting
Yeah.
because it helped reduce the number of times an intrusive memory would come to mind.
Wow. Incredible. And so, I mean, you were doing this in real world settings eventually.
Yeah, it took about maybe 15 years in the lab, a huge amount of experiments to get the parameters right. But if you go back, I guess like everything, every time we invent a new technique in CBT, like exposure, there's a lot of lab work on
Yeah,
exposure before you get to actually
it's
doing exposure.
true.
So um, these things take time. So there's a lot of lab experiments, and then we started using it with people waiting in the emergency room after real trauma as a kind of preventative technique. I did a
Wow.
couple of RCTs on that, showing that we could use ICT to prevent the buildup of flashbacks.
Wow.
What I'm most excited about at the moment is we've been doing it for people who've experienced trauma, got established intrusive memories and flashbacks of that trauma, can even be under repeated trauma exposure, and yet they can use this intervention to bring down their intrusive memories of trauma and their other symptoms of PTSD
It's
without having to
incredible.
talk about their trauma, just by doing it visually and using the visual procedure. So it's pretty much visual. I think there's about 5 or 6 words in the whole thing, but apart from that, it's visual all the way along.
Wow, incredible. And so I remember reading you said that even just one guided session can make a difference. Talk about that.
So in the randomized control trials that we've done now, we've just about to publish the third in February, actually. We worked with people who exposed to trauma in the COVID-19 pandemic,
Oh,
who are working, for example, in ICU. So ICU doctors and nurses are seeing a lot of patients dying, getting a lot of trauma exposure. And as you know from both America, the UK, and other countries, there was a huge increase in PTSD in this staff group. So
right.
they were very interested in a brief treatment that they could use. Um, and we worked with them as to make this very brief digital form
Mm,
of ICT because we didn't want to do it in person because of obviously transmission risk. And in that, what we learned is very interesting work. Was very early on, I said to them, "How much time would you like to have to spend on the therapy?" And they were like, "30 minutes max." Oh dear.
wow. Oh
Okay.
my. Figure
um,
it out.
yeah. Well, that's our job as scientists as well. So we
Right.
try to package the whole thing into a single guided procedure where the active treatment's half an hour.
Wow.
And we did. And that's what we ended up, there's a lot of work, but we ended up trialing with this one session guided procedure. And I have full respect. When you're saving patients' lives, you do not have a lot of time. So we're just trying to do
That's
something that
right.
will fit into their working schedules. So that they just have one guided session with us. It's clear they didn't really want to meet us that much. That's fine. Um, and then we would give them enough skills within that. And I think that's very important to me is to share through the imagery work that we're giving away our skills so someone can keep using it on their own images. Um, they would learn enough to use it again. So we had one guided session with us, and then if they needed to use it again, they could.
Yeah.
And many people, most people, about 40% had another new trauma within a month. So they could use it again if they had a new or different intrusive memory, use the ICT procedure. And shall I tell you the results?
Wow. Yes, I want to hear it.
So beginning of I mean, this is the beginning of the trial, for example, the last one that we published, people have about 14 intrusive memories flashbacks per week at baseline, which, as you know, is really
Wow.
high.
Wow.
Um, but 4 weeks later, it's gone down to one, and we now
Wow.
know that result that it that the gains are maintained. There's no rebound over 6 months,
That's
so it's a
incredible.
very precise procedure. It's just this one image, target it with the ICT, it'll stop flashing back.
Gosh, what an incredible outcome for an intervention that is not like a medication or some sort of a surgical procedure. What an incredible outcome. You must be excited.
Thank you, Katie. It means a lot actually, because I think if we can think about CBT being like at times we need every thing we can have in the toolkit in CBT,
It's
but
true.
I think this does make it a little bit like a medicine because it's like a very, very precise tool
That's right.
that if this were a drug, absolutely,
Mhm.
and we did our trials actually to drug trial standards, um,
Wow.
we can show efficacy, we can show safety, and we can show the precision of just like in precision medicine, one image, do one treatment on that image goes down.
It's
And then
incredible.
this beautiful domino effect, just as we
Mhm.
predict from our CBT models, if we take
Right.
out the nasty image, the other symptoms dissipate.
Wow. It's remarkable. So surgical and precise. I love it. I just love it.
That's a
So
great phrase, surgical. Yeah, it's a bit like
it's
cognitive
true.
surgery, I guess.
That's right. It is. We're just taking that piece out and then seeing that, like you said, the domino effect. So
Yeah.
this, the work that you've done, it reflects this broader vision for the field. And you ended up co-authoring this book, Imagery-Based Cognitive Therapy for Bipolar Disorder and Mood Instability. Did I get that right? Did I
You
say it right?
did. Sorry,
Okay.
it's the longest title of a book. I'm not very good at words.
That's all right. So, what gap were you hoping that the book would fill for clinicians so that clinicians know kind of what to expect from the book?
Um, well, I think the gap that was hoping to fill with the book was to demystify imagery a bit. and to make it very, very practical. We'd written a first book, which was like, I think the first book on imagery and CBT in about 2012. And I think that was nice saying, hey, images are here and having experts talk about the way they used it. But this book was much more like, could we have a manual which spelt out exactly what to do and that um, both us as therapists and our clients could read it, same book, be very transparent, and just try and manualize it a little bit. So, yes, the title's got bipolar and it's for emotional stability, but I think a lot of the technique, well, there's 4 imagery techniques in there, but we hope that they're much clearer. And I think that's what therapists often wish for or ask about is what exactly do I do? Which is a really fair question. So it was a start in that direction, Katie. I hope.
Right.
But there's so much more that needs to be done and books that need to be
Right.
written, but it was a first step.
Right. Oh, isn't that wonderful? So, what do you think becomes possible when CBT is more tightly connected? Because I mean, I can hear it that you're sort of approaching this from a more integrated perspective, right? And so, what do you think happens when CBT is more tightly connected with basic science? And I've heard it as you and I have been talking, you're talking about the brain. We're not just talking about sort of psychological theories, we're talking about other things.
I think there's an amazing opportunity for CBT. If we go back to the very early roots of CBT, CBT has always been based, going all the way back to Pavlov, understanding
It's
conditioning.
true.
Like, we're so lucky to be living in this era where we couldn't have done this 100 years ago. Like, we've
True.
got these experiments and these voyages about the way our minds work to help guide our techniques, and we are a scientific based profession.
That's
And
right.
so we build on the shoulder of giants in memory and emotion and neuroscience and learning. And I suppose what I'm passionate about as well is thinking when it works, how can we understand why it works and how we can get it to work when it doesn't work? And how can we use science to keep building new techniques?
Mm.
So I think with Michelle Krass, for example, we kind of coined the term with colleagues mental health science. Like
Yes.
CBT is such a central part of that. And I think yeah, it's a very, very hopeful way forward.
I like that term, mental health science. And I did want to touch on the work that you've done with Michelle Krask and give you an opportunity to talk about that. So, how do you see imagery focused techniques fitting alongside these exposure-based treatments within CBT? We've talked a little bit about it, but I'd like to hear more.
I think one of the wonderful things about CBT is it's a broad field, and I think um, I remember being at a conference once and Beck saying CBT is whatever works, right? So I
That's
think the
right.
way I would see it as is is we need to choose our tool based on what the client needs, what we like doing.
Mhm.
Of course, you can have imaginal exposure. Some things we can't do in vivo exposure on,
That's
and
true.
imaginal work becomes very, very, very helpful.
That's right.
As we were discussing earlier, I think you're recruiting the same perceptual areas with real perception or imagined perception, so that gives you lots of extra tools. So I think it's not antithetical at all. I think it's very, very. I think we should be looking for the and, not the or.
Or,
Like it's a
mhm,
plus plus.
right.
Um, and yeah, I think we just need to ask. I mean, I suspect there's some really interesting basic science questions to ask about different mechanisms, but if we were in the era of cancer medicine, we'd want every mechanism in the world to work, right?
That's right.
And we want to know how to tailor it. And I wouldn't it be amazing if we start doing that even more in mental health?
It's true. It's true. And it's interesting. You and I were talking beforehand about I work with OCD so much, and there are just so many obsessive fears that people have that we can't
Yeah.
do in vivo. We can't really do in vivo
Hmm.
work. And so we have to be comfortable working in
Yeah.
imagery, right? We just have to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It just gives us
So
an extra tool. It's not a
it's
replacement,
true.
it's an extra
No,
tool.
exactly right. Exactly right.
Yeah.
And for most people, they do have both. We're able to do the in vivo work, but we have to
Yeah.
have that work in image, the imagery work that we
Yeah.
do. So if we zoom out a little bit and as you look ahead, what most excites you about where imagery focused work in CBT is going?
Ooh. um, Gosh, now I'm having my own little flurry of images. I think wouldn't it be amazing to have a CBT? Actually, sorry, this is a real divergent reply, but I was like,
It's
wouldn't it be
okay.
amazing to have a CBT conference where we could almost have like a CBT imagery gallery and like talk about this stuff and really
Oh,
bring this stuff to life. But I don't think that's on the horizon in the short term. But I think just opening a dialogue, learning from people, and I think for me personally in my own science voyage, I have a real commitment to try and keep developing and bring to reality the imagery competing task intervention, just because it is so brief and gentle and yet
right.
CBT informed. Um, and to think, gosh, well, if it's working on trauma images, maybe even KT one day, it might be helpful for other kind of images. So to work
Yeah.
with people like you to understand what's needed and how we can support that through an imagery science voyage.
It's fantastic. And I have to tell you, I learned a little something about you from Christine that you were
Oh,
not always training to be a psychologist. There was a time, right, that you were an artist. Talk,
mm.
talk a little bit about that. I know I didn't prepare you at all for that question, but tell
uh,
tell me about how that informs your work. Because as you talked about us having a conference where it's all about sort of a gallery of imagery, it made me think
yeah.
of that.
Yeah, I don't know why that image popped to my head, but oh gosh, yeah, I remember Katie. It's really sweet of you to raise that, but I remember like early in my career, I was used to pretend that I hadn't. Like it felt a bit odd to have gone to art college. So it's finally nice to be able to admit that art is something that is very dear to my heart. I was the kid at school who was dyslexic, who was terrible at words, who
Mm,
got put down, all that, like, couldn't read. So I guess for me, drawing had always been a really important communication tool, but also just something, yeah, I absolutely, it's my second home is the visual arts, I guess. And
yeah.
perhaps what happened is that I think I bring that visual way of thinking into my science and in particular into wanting to be able to talk to people about their imagery. So yeah, I feel really privileged to be part of both linked to the art world to some extent and also to the science and the CBT world. But yeah,
I think
art's
that
wonderful.
right. I think, but it really took somebody who came to the science table, to the CBT table with this really powerful background of sort of translating imagery, right? In an artistic way to be able to do this kind of work. I think you bring such a unique perspective. It's really neat.
But thank you. And I think CBT is wonderful because it gives like it's like to me the magic of formulation, like this idea of negotiating a structure to start
Hmm.
understanding the world, and that we can
Right,
also do that
right.
even for one image is just
Mm.
so incredibly helpful and powerful.
Yeah,
So yeah, it's
powerful.
a
I
real
agree.
privilege to be part of this world.
I agree. So if we're talking about what you would like clinicians to take away from, one idea, if they had to take away one idea from your work in mental imagery, what would you most hope stays with them?
Um, just to practice defining imagery and asking people about it and being curious, and the rest will follow. And
Right.
that many people are probably already doing that. So if they're already doing that, then I would encourage people to think about CBT being a really creative and scientific profession, and perhaps looking at some of the most recent imagery research papers that are really pushing new frontiers um, and helping us be part of that expanding CBT for the future.
Yeah. And I know you have an incredible role in that too, really pushing the frontier. So thank you so much for your contributions to the field. Thank you for sharing your work with us today and for telling us a little bit more about your journey and what brought you here with us. It's been such a pleasure, and thank you to everybody for watching this series and for reading our blog. And we hope this conversation really sparks some curiosity in people about mental imagery. We hope you start asking your clients about exactly what Emily has been talking about today, and how the idea of working within imagery can really open up a whole new possibility for your clients and your CBT clients. So thank you so much, Emily, and we look forward to next month to see what we have in this series. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much, Katie. It's been a real privilege to discuss with you, and thank you for your questions. It's made me think a lot.
Oh, wonderful.